My life with my wife was quite ordinary, but at the same time stable, and as it seemed to me, strong. We were that couple that people usually call the perfect family. Our marriage was built on trust, and despite my job, which required constant traveling, we always found a balance. I work as a truck driver for a well-known logistics company, and although my profession is not easy, I've always enjoyed it. There was something calming about the road, those endless highways I traveled with my truck. However, of course, this job left its mark on our relationship. Frequent trips meant that I could be gone for days, sometimes even weeks. My wife, unlike me, worked in the office of the same company where I work. She was the secretary of the head of the main department, a much more prestigious position compared to mine. Sometimes I even felt a bit envious of her. Sitting in a warm office, interacting with people, and getting paid more than me, who hauled cargo across the world. But, as they say, to each their own. Her charm, intelligence, and ability to handle things landed her that position with ease. We had been living in this rhythm for several years. Everything was going as usual. Work, rare weekends, occasional meetings with friends, and of course, time spent with my wife. I wish there was more of it, but unfortunately, my schedule didn't always allow that. And then, suddenly, things began to change. Work became overwhelming. I didn't notice how the occasional trips turned into endless journeys. It felt like I was on the road more than I was at home. Of course, I was being paid well for it, and financially, things were much better. But with that came the growing feeling that I was losing time. Time that I could have spent with my wife, with my friends, or just by myself. I noticed that my colleagues didn't seem to have this issue. Everyone stuck to their usual schedules, while I was constantly being sent on additional trips. It started to really bother me. One day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to my boss. I knew his office probably as well as I knew my truck's cab. It was a huge, spacious room with a large window overlooking almost the entire city. When I walked in, he looked as busy as ever, but when he saw me, he managed to spare a few minutes for a conversation. I started by saying that I was unhappy with my current schedule. I explained that no one had even asked me if I was willing to take on so much work, and that I was simply told, "You'll be driving more, and that's it." It felt unfair, especially compared to my other colleagues. My boss is a composed, polite man. He listened carefully and responded by saying that I was one of the most responsible and competent drivers, and that's why he assigned me the most challenging routes. He also added that he was ready to compensate for the inconvenience with additional payments. It seemed like, on the surface, there wasn't much to complain about. I had work, I was making money. What was there to worry about? But something inside me began to tell me that it wasn't just about work. However, after thinking it over, I agreed. Quitting or refusing a good salary would have been foolish. Besides, my wife always supported me in earning more. So I accepted my boss's offer, telling myself that it was only temporary and that things would get better in time. With each new trip, it became harder and harder for me to remain calm. I was spending more time on the road than at home, and although the money kept flowing, the feeling of unease was growing. I started thinking more often about how our life was changing. My wife and I were talking less and less, spending less and less time together. She was busy with her work, and I with mine. And if before we used to enjoy talking in the evenings or spending weekends together, now even that was gone. Sometimes, when I would return home after a long trip, I noticed that something had changed. Nothing specific, just little things. For example, her gaze seemed more distant, and she no longer shared details about her work. If before she would tell me about everything that happened at the office, the jokes, the colleagues, now every response to my questions felt dry, as if she was avoiding the conversation. I chalked it up to exhaustion. We were both working a lot, so it seemed like a reasonable explanation. But one day, during one of my rare days off, I came home unexpectedly early. That day, I didn't have to go on a trip, and I decided to surprise my wife. I bought flowers, planned to take her out for dinner, just spend the evening together. However, as I approached our house, I noticed a car parked nearby. It was her boss's car. Of course, I knew his car. I had seen it plenty of times in the office parking lot. My heart started beating faster, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he had just stopped by for business? After all, work could extend beyond office hours. But the more I thought about it, the more my doubts grew. Deciding not to rush in, I approached the door, but I didn't go inside immediately. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stop and listen. Through the closed door, I could hear voices, her voice and his. They were laughing. It wasn't the kind of laughter that happens between colleagues. Something inside me flipped. I decided to knock. When I walked into the house that evening, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was as if the heavy weight of suspicion that had been gnawing at me for the past few weeks had suddenly lifted. The scene before me was completely ordinary. My wife and our boss were sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and documents. They both seemed completely absorbed in their work, and for a moment, it felt like I had walked in on just another busy workday. There was no tension in the air, no awkwardness, no signs of anything other than professionalism. I stood there for a few moments, just watching them. They were so focused on their papers that they didn't even notice me right away. It wasn't until I cleared my throat slightly that they both looked up. My wife greeted me with her usual warm smile, and our boss nodded politely, offering a quick apology. He explained that they had a lot of work to finish, and since they couldn't get it done at the office, they had no choice but to bring it home. His tone was calm and casual, almost too casual. I could feel my heart racing, but I forced myself to smile and nod in response. After all, what reason did I have to doubt them? They had always maintained a professional relationship, and I trusted my wife completely. Or at least, I used to. The boss quickly packed up his things, mumbling another apology as he shoved documents into his briefcase. He seemed eager to leave, not in a suspicious way, but more in a way that suggested he was just as tired as anyone else after a long day of work. In my mind, I reasoned that I had probably overreacted. There was nothing out of the ordinary happening here. This was just work, and work sometimes spilled over into personal time. I knew that better than anyone. Before leaving, he paused for a moment, looking at both of us. "Sorry again for the intrusion," he said, giving me a polite nod and my wife a brief smile. Then, without another word, he slipped out the door, leaving us in the silence of the kitchen. My wife approached me, her smile soft and affectionate, the same smile she always gave me after a long day apart. She kissed me lightly on the cheek and gestured to the dining table. "I made dinner," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "Sit down, let's eat." As I sat down at the table, the warmth of her gesture started to ease the tension in my chest. Maybe I had been imagining things. Maybe the long hours on the road were starting to get to me, filling my head with baseless doubts. The rest of the evening unfolded as it always did. We talked over dinner, about her day and mine, about the usual mundane details of life. It felt normal. It felt right. But even though that night seemed to erase my suspicions, the relief was short-lived. Something lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging thought that refused to go away. Over the next few weeks, my long hauls continued. I spent hours on the road, alone with my thoughts. And the more time I spent away from home, the more those small moments of doubt began to creep back in. It wasn't one specific thing, just a growing discomfort, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The late-night meetings with her boss became more frequent. If it wasn't at our house, she would mention going to his place to finish up some urgent documents. Each time, she had a reasonable explanation, and each time, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about. But as these moments became more frequent, I couldn't help but notice how much they were starting to bother me. It was the same routine. Her boss would either stay late at our house, or she'd spend long hours at his. Every time, there was a perfectly logical reason. "It's just work," she'd say. "We're swamped with deadlines." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her, as I always had. But something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but deep down, I felt uneasy. I began to analyze every little detail. The way she spoke about work, the way she avoided eye contact when mentioning her boss, the subtle shift in her tone when I asked about her day. Nothing was overtly suspicious, but together, these small changes began to pile up in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was more going on beneath the surface than what I was being told. One evening, after returning from another long trip, I decided I couldn't keep these feelings to myself any longer. I came home earlier than expected, hoping to catch my wife alone and have a serious conversation. Thankfully, this time she was home without her boss, and we had the evening to ourselves. As we sat down for dinner, I tried to think of the best way to bring up the topic without sounding accusatory. I didn't want to make her feel like I was interrogating her, but at the same time, I needed answers. As we ate, I began to gently steer the conversation toward the things that had been bothering me. I told her how I felt, how I had noticed the increasing frequency of her meetings with the boss, and how it was making me uncomfortable. I didn't accuse her of anything, but I made it clear that I wasn't happy with the way things were going. I just don't want to see you spending so much time with him, even if it's for work, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's starting to affect how I feel about us. She looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to bring this up. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, she began to offer the same explanations I had heard before. It's really just work, she insisted, her voice calm but slightly defensive. We've been slammed with deadlines, and I don't have any choice. He's my boss after all. I listened to her, but this time, I didn't let her words wash away my concerns. I calmly reiterated how much this situation was bothering me, how I didn't like the idea of her spending so much time with him outside of office hours, even if it was for work. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her plate as she thought over my words. Finally, she sighed and nodded. I understand, she said quietly. If it's really bothering you that much, I'll try to keep it more professional. I won't let him stay over for work anymore, and I'll make sure to finish everything at the office. Her agreement brought me a sense of relief, but it was only temporary. While I appreciated that she was willing to address my concerns, there was still something lingering, something that made me question whether the issue had really been resolved. It wasn't that I didn't believe her words. I wanted to believe her. But those seeds of doubt that had been planted in my mind refused to go away. I tried to push them aside, to convince myself that everything was back to normal, but the unease remained. Even after she agreed to limit their after-hours meetings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I left for another trip, the doubts would resurface. I found myself thinking about it constantly, wondering if I had truly gotten to the bottom of what was going on. Was I just being paranoid? Or was there more to the situation than what she was telling me? Time went on, and life continued as usual. But in the back of my mind, those doubts lingered, waiting for the moment when they would resurface again. Since I had the conversation with my wife about my concerns, things had only gotten worse. Work continued to be just as demanding, but what troubled me the most was that my paycheck had started to shrink. I was being paid less and less for my trips, and over time it began to really irritate me. The frustration grew day by day, and I couldn't just let it slide anymore. Everything was starting to irritate me: work, the constant fatigue, and my nagging suspicions about what was happening between my wife and her boss. It all kept building up inside me, and I decided it was time to confront him directly. I needed answers, not just about the declining pay, but also about the nagging feeling that something wasn't right between them. One day, after my wife had finished her shift, I went to the office, determined to talk to the boss. As I approached his office, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. My wife, who usually sat just outside his office greeting people, wasn't there. It was late, and she should have been at her desk. A cold feeling started creeping in, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe she stepped out for a moment, I thought, trying to calm myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided not to wait and knocked on the door. There was no answer. The silence seemed too loud. Pressing my ear against the door, I was hit by a wave of horror. I heard noises that were unmistakable. Moans, the rustling of papers, the unmistakable sounds of something in. A chill ran down my spine. Time seemed to slow down as I realized what I was about to walk into. Without thinking, I pushed the door open, and there it was, a scene I had only imagined in my worst nightmares. Right there, on the desk, among the scattered papers and clothes, my wife was having sex with our boss. For a moment, everything froze. It was as if the whole world stopped spinning. I couldn't breathe. Their faces, filled with shock and disbelief, mirrored mine. I saw every detail: the way my wife's expression shifted from surprise to shame, the way her boss fumbled to cover himself with the documents, as if that could somehow erase what I had just witnessed. But nothing they could say or do mattered to me anymore. The betrayal was so raw, so real, that I couldn't even process it. All I could do was pull out my phone, take a picture of the scene in front of me, and walk out. I didn't want to hear their excuses. I didn't care about their apologies. I didn't care about anything at that moment. I don't remember how I got home. It was all a blur. My mind was consumed by one thought: how could this happen? When I finally made it home, I headed straight for the whiskey, poured myself a glass, and collapsed on the couch. I just sat there, staring blankly at the wall, letting the drink numb my senses. An hour passed, maybe more. I wasn't even sure. My mind was racing between memories of all the happy moments we had shared, all the love I thought we had, and then back to the painful reality of what I had just seen. It felt like I had been deceived in the cruelest way possible, and there was no going back. When my wife finally returned home, I heard the soft click of the door as she stepped inside. I didn't even look at her. She walked in as if nothing had happened, as if everything could somehow go back to normal. But I didn't want to see her. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't need an explanation. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand, signaling that there would be no conversation. Inside, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. There was no anger, no pain, just a hollow void. I simply told her to leave. There was no shouting, no fight. I didn't want her in the house anymore. She tried to resist, to say how sorry she was, to explain that it had been a mistake. But I wasn't listening. Nothing she could say would change anything. I stood by the door, pointing for her to leave, and after a moment of hesitation, she realized it was over. She packed up her things and quietly left. I closed the door behind her and stood there in the deafening silence. For a while, I just stood still, processing everything. I didn't feel anything at that moment. No rage, no despair, just nothing. After that horrible day when I caught my wife with the boss, I knew I couldn't stay in the company any longer. Continuing to work there, seeing him every day, and even worse, knowing that my wife was still somehow connected to him, was beyond what I could bear. I realized I had to leave, and the sooner I did it, the better for my own peace of mind. When I went back to his office, it wasn't an easy meeting. I was no longer the employee who was just asking for explanations or a raise. This time, I was in a different mindset. As soon as I walked in, he looked at me with that same smirk, the one I now hated with all my heart. Starting the conversation was difficult because everything inside me was boiling, but I knew I had to speak up. I began by saying that I never could have imagined him being such a vile person. I admitted that up until the last moment, I believed in his integrity, despite the growing number of red flags. I told him that I couldn't work for someone who betrayed me and ruined my life. But his response was as disgusting as his behavior. He sarcastically said, "Sorry," with a crooked grin on his face, as if he was savoring what he had done. Then it got even worse. He started talking about what a wonderful wife I had, using a tone as if it were a compliment, and went on, "Yeah, I intentionally piled work on you. I wanted to make sure you didn't get distracted and didn't have time to notice what was happening right under your nose. It was so easy. You go off on your long-haul trips, and we stay here in the office." He didn't get to finish. At that moment, the rage that had been building inside me since I saw them on that table exploded. I could only see his smug face and hear his mocking words. Without thinking, I grabbed a vase from his desk and threw it straight at his face. The vase hit his head with a loud crash, and for a moment, I saw his expression change to a mix of pain and shock. But that wasn't enough for me. My anger took over, and I lunged at him with my fists. I hit him again and again, feeling neither pity nor fear of the consequences. All I could think about was how he had destroyed my life, betrayed my trust, and brazenly laughed in my face. When I finally stopped, he was lying on the floor of his office, groaning and trying to get up. I left the office without even turning around at his threats. He shouted something about how I would regret this, how he had connections and wouldn't let me get away with it. But I didn't care. At that moment, I felt only a strange satisfaction that at least I had managed to physically release some of my pain. A few days later, I received a notice that I was being sued for assault. I knew it was coming, and I was ready for it. But I wasn't afraid. Court? Let it be court. It would be my chance to either justify myself, or at least face that scumbag again and watch his smugness slowly fade away. Of course, thanks to rumors, all my colleagues quickly found out what had happened. I thought I would become an outcast, but to my surprise, many supported me. Some even decided to come to court as witnesses, ready to tell what they knew. All this time, I feared that no one would understand me, that my colleagues would side with the boss since he had a reputation as a powerful and respected person. But they knew the truth, and the truth was on my side. When the case went to court, I wasn't alone. I had photographic proof of the affair and witnesses who backed up my story. Of course, the boss had connections, and he tried to use them to turn the situation in his favor. He portrayed me as the aggressor, himself as the innocent victim, trying to convince the court that I had lost control and attacked him without cause. But with every word he spoke, with every fake argument, the truth became more and more apparent. My colleagues stood up for me, talking about how he had overloaded me with work, how he had created conditions where I couldn't figure out what was going on behind my back. And most importantly, I presented the court with that same photograph, which immediately shattered his version of events. It was all I needed for victory. The court ruled in my favor. My boss couldn't justify his actions, and even his connections couldn't save his reputation. He lost everything. The story became a huge scandal within the company, and half of the employees resigned soon after. The company began to collapse because no one wanted to work with a man whose reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed. As for my wife, her reputation didn't remain unscathed either. Everything she once had was destroyed as well. People no longer respected her. No one wanted to deal with her. She, like my boss, was cast out from the circle in which she had once held a place. That was the end of their power over me.